Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the money you've saved, the bills in your wallet, the digits in your bank account, are suddenly meaningless. Not just less valuable, but worthless. It sounds like dystopian fiction, but for millions across time and geography, this has been reality. Today, we're diving into one of the most jarring breakdowns a society can face: hyperinflation. Not just rising prices, but the collapse of an entire monetary system, where paper becomes confetti, and trust, the very foundation of money, evaporates. Hyperinflation is more than an economic event. It is a historical phenomenon that strikes without mercy, often in the wake of war, political upheaval, or unchecked monetary experiments. Savings are wiped out, economies grind to a halt, and societies teeter on the edge of chaos. In this presentation, we'll explore three pivotal case studies: Weimar Germany in the wake of World War I, Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, and Venezuela in the 2010s. These nations serve as cautionary tales, each showcasing how decisions made by those in power can ripple into disaster when monetary discipline is lost. But here's the real question: what actually causes a currency to collapse? What chain of events turns a functioning economy into a barter-based survival game? And more importantly, can we learn from the past to avoid repeating it? By the end of this journey, you'll see that hyperinflation isn't just a story about numbers. It's a mirror, reflecting deeper truths about power, trust, and the fragility of the systems we take for granted. Let's begin. Before we dive into the stories, let's define exactly what we mean by hyperinflation, because this isn't just your everyday rise in prices. Hyperinflation is when inflation exceeds 50% per month. That's not per year, per month. At that rate, the cost of goods can double every few days. In extreme cases, every few hours. But here's the key: a hyperinflation doesn't just mean things are getting more expensive. It means the currency itself has stopped working. The system of value exchange breaks down. Trust in money vanishes, and people begin to search for anything: gold, foreign cash, even food, that will actually hold value. Now, economists disagree on what causes this breakdown. Austrian economists argue that it's primarily a result of excessive money printing, when central banks expand the money supply far beyond the real wealth of a country. On the other hand, Keynesian thinkers often emphasize psychological factors, like a sudden loss of confidence in the currency or major shocks to supply and demand. Who's right? Well, history might offer some clues, but regardless of the theory, one thing is universal: hyperinflation represents a collapse of trust, not just in prices, but in the entire monetary system. When people no longer believe that the money they earn today will buy something tomorrow, they stop participating in the economy in normal ways. And that's when everything starts to fall apart. So how does this trust break? Often, it begins with monetary policy failure, when central banks operate without restraint, printing money to solve short-term problems, while quietly eroding long-term stability. And once that trust is broken, rebuilding it can take generations. Let's look at our first historical case to see how this unfolds in real life. Our first stop takes us to post-World War I Germany, a nation burdened, bitter, and broke. The year is 1919. Germany has just signed the Treaty of Versailles, and with it comes a financial noose: reparations. Massive ones, the kind that would require generations to repay. The problem? Germany didn't have the gold. What they did have was a printing press. To meet these crushing reparation demands, the Reichsbank, the German central bank, did what seemed like the easiest solution at the time: print more money. They abandoned the gold standard, severing their currency from any tangible backing. It was money without anchors, just ink and paper. But in doing so, they opened the door to disaster. At first, it seemed to work. Bills were paid, obligations met. But by 1922, prices were doubling monthly. By late 1923, they were doubling every few days. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war now cost hundreds of billions. Yes, billions. Families carried their wages home in wheelbarrows. Children used stacks of banknotes as building blocks. It was surreal. This wasn't just economic chaos. It was social breakdown. People lost their life savings overnight. Middle-class families were pushed into poverty. Businesses failed. Civil servants couldn't eat. Faith in institutions dissolved, and desperate citizens turned to radical ideologies that promised order and revival. The hyperinflation of Weimar Germany wasn't just a financial event, it was a societal implosion. And in its aftermath, seeds were planted. Seeds of resentment, of extremism, of movements that would one day plunge the world into an even darker chapter. This is what happens when money loses its meaning, and with it, the trust that holds a nation together. Let's now travel to a different continent, a different century, but a hauntingly similar story. Our next story unfolds in southern Africa, Zimbabwe, between the late 1990s and 2008. This time, the trigger wasn't war reparations, it was land. In the name of justice and redistribution, the Zimbabwean government launched a massive land reform program, seizing commercial farmland from white landowners and redistributing it. Now, on paper, this may have sounded like equity, but in practice, the farms were handed to individuals without the equipment, experience, or infrastructure to run them. Food production collapsed almost overnight. Agriculture was the backbone of Zimbabwe's economy. With that foundation destroyed, GDP fell, export income dried up, and food scarcity began to grip the population. To cover deficits and pay for subsidies and social programs, the government turned to a familiar tool, the printing press. But as in Weimar Germany, printing money without increasing real production only fuels one thing: hyperinflation. And hyperinflation in Zimbabwe wasn't just extreme, it was astronomical. By November 2008, the official inflation rate hit 79.6 billion%. That's billion with a BE. Money lost value faster than people could spend it. Prices were rewritten by the hour. The government issued $100 trillion notes, which still weren't enough to buy bread. And what about the people? They suffered. Businesses closed, jobs vanished, millions emigrated, fleeing to neighboring countries. Those who stayed turned to barter or relied on foreign currencies, especially the US dollar. The Zimbabwean dollar was no longer trusted, no longer accepted, no longer useful. This wasn't just a collapse in policy, it was a collapse in daily life, one that turned a functioning economy into survival mode. Let's turn now to a more recent example, still fresh in the global memory, and see how the same story repeated, this time in the heart of a petrostate. Now we arrive in Venezuela, a nation once celebrated as one of the wealthiest in Latin America, rich in oil, industry, and potential. But by 2014, the foundations were already cracking. For years, Venezuela had leaned heavily on oil exports to fund nearly everything: social programs, imports, government salaries. But when global oil prices crashed in 2014, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Suddenly, the government's cash cow was dry. Instead of adjusting spending or opening markets, the state doubled down. It imposed strict price controls, nationalized industries, and, of course, began printing money to cover its growing deficits. Sound familiar? Inflation surged. But what made Venezuela unique was just how long the government tried to mask the crisis. Official statistics were manipulated or simply stopped being released. Meanwhile, citizens watched as food vanished from shelves, electricity became unreliable, and the currency eroded by the day. By 2018, inflation surpassed 1,000,000%. People lost weight simply because they couldn't find food. Pets were abandoned. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. The once proud bolivar became toilet paper, sometimes literally. And again, as with Zimbabwe, people turned to the US dollar, or even cryptocurrency, to survive. The collapse wasn't just economic, it was deeply human. Millions fled the country, creating one of the largest refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere. Families were torn apart, trust in leadership plummeted, and a once thriving society was brought to its knees by decisions made in palace halls, far from the suffering on the streets. 3 countries, 3 time periods, 3 different contexts, but eerily similar outcomes. Now let's pull back and ask, what patterns are we seeing? When we lay these stories side by side, Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, a pattern begins to emerge. Different cultures, different decades, different causes, yet the outcomes all rhyme. First, we see a trigger event. It could be war and reparations, like in Weimar Germany. It could be a collapsing export sector, like oil in Venezuela, or a disastrous land reform in Zimbabwe. These events destabilize the economy and set off panic. They shake the system's ability to generate real wealth. Next comes monetary expansion, governments printing money in a desperate attempt to cover costs, pay workers, or fund programs. But here's the truth. When real production shrinks and money supply grows, you're not solving the problem. You're multiplying it. More money chasing fewer goods is the perfect recipe for inflation. And when trust in that money collapses, it becomes hyperinflation. Then come the price controls and currency manipulation. Leaders try to fix symptoms rather than causes, capping prices, threatening merchants, introducing new currency notes with more zeros or a different name. But these are cosmetic changes on a system that's fundamentally broken. And finally, we see social collapse. Savings are wiped out. Institutions are discredited. People lose faith, not just in the currency, but in the very structure of their society. Migration surges, crime rises, and often, extremist ideologies step in to fill the vacuum. These aren't isolated incidents. They are warnings. They show what happens when governments believe they can control markets without consequences. When they treat the printing press as a magic wand. When they forget that money only works because we believe it does. So, what can we learn from these repeated mistakes? Let's explore the lessons that history offers, lessons we ignore at our own peril. So, what lessons can we take away from these economic catastrophes? What are these case studies really telling us, not just about money, but about the systems we rely on? First, trust is everything. Money isn't valuable because it's printed on fancy paper or has the right hologram. It's valuable because we all agree to believe in it. Once that belief erodes, once people stop trusting that a bill in their hand will be worth something tomorrow, the entire economy starts to unravel fast. Second, money printing is not a free lunch. It may seem like a clever way to avoid raising taxes or cutting spending, or just create more currency, right? But history shows us that unchecked monetary expansion always comes with a price. It devalues savings. It punishes responsible behavior. And worst of all, it hits the poorest the hardest. Third, price controls backfire. Governments often try to protect citizens by capping the price of goods. But when they do, producers can't cover costs. Shelves go empty, black markets emerge, and suddenly, access to food or medicine depends not on money, but on connections or bribes. And finally, restoring stability is incredibly hard once trust is lost. You can't just declare a new currency and expect people to fall in line. You need real reforms, real production, real accountability. Without those, the system can't rebuild. These lessons aren't locked in the past. They're alive today. Because any nation, yes, even the wealthiest, can fall into these traps when short-term fixes override long-term thinking. But we're not done yet. There's one more question that matters now more than ever. Could it happen again? Let's talk about the present. Now here's the question that makes people uncomfortable, but it needs to be asked. Could it happen again? Let's be clear, hyperinflation isn't inevitable, but it's also not a relic of the past. It's a risk that still lurks beneath the surface when a few key ingredients mix: massive government debt, central banks printing to cover shortfalls, economic shocks, and, most dangerously, blind trust that it could never happen here. Look around today. Many countries are running deficits they can't afford. Central banks have embraced easy money policies for years. And in times of crisis, like war or pandemic, printing more has become the go-to solution. But history reminds us, there is no such thing as free money. Weimar Germany didn't think it could happen. Zimbabwe thought it was redistributing fairness. Venezuela thought oil would protect them forever. But in each case, leaders underestimated the power of incentives, ignored market signals, and gambled with the one thing no society can afford to lose: public trust. So could it happen again? The better question might be, how do we stop it from happening again? That's a conversation worth having. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. If you learned something today, don't forget to like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more content that dives deep into the past to make sense of the present. And if you enjoy history that challenges assumptions and connects the dots, check out our other videos. We've got plenty of stories the textbooks left out.